Welcome to Unit 1 of the Competency-Based Learning module. In this unit, we will hear from Michael Poulin, Coordinator and Professor of an Education Preparation Institute. Professor Poulin has gained experiences in competency-based learning through his role in the Institute's Competency-Based Alternative Teacher Certification Program. Throughout this video, Professor Poulin will share his personal experiences with competency-based learning and offer his advice as you continue your journey through the competency-based learning module. How does the design and structure of competency-based classrooms affect how students learn?
In a competency-based program, your class design typically begins with well-designed and very specific learning objectives. And your instruction may begin, let's say, with a short introduction, maybe a quick demonstration or two, some guided practice, and then reflection and closure on the student's part to kind of reflect back on what they've learned and you summarizing in your closing activity what the students should have learned from your lesson. You follow that up with an assessment, and then usually an enrichment activity in which you build upon the skills that you introduced in that lesson. This tends to be very different from a traditional setting where students satisfy a prescribed amount of seat time, or the goal is to get through the material according to a pacing guide. In a competency-based program, the material and concepts are not covered, but instead the students actually show competency of a concept, and then they are assessed in a measurable way on the mastery of that concept. If they do not meet the minimum competency requirements, then you go on for remediation.
How might the role of the teacher and the focus of the learning in a competency-based classroom affect how students learn?
One way in which the competency-based model affects how students learn in the classroom is the role of the teacher. Typically, the role of the teacher in a traditional classroom setting is to stand up in front of the classroom, maybe give a lecture, give the students an activity, and do a quick wrap-up. In a competency-based program, the focus of the learning is on competency of the student or proof of mastery of the content. For example, let's say that we're teaching a third grade science class, and one of the benchmarks states that students will recognize the differences between solids and liquids. Instead of just covering some of the differences in a lesson plan, in a competency-based program, you typically begin with a very specific, measurable objective. Let's say that objective is the student will measure and compare temperatures of solids and liquids. When you have a very specific objective such as that one, your instruction is then driven toward teaching your students how to measure and compare temperatures of solids and liquids, so that by the end of the lesson, for their assessment, they actually show you that they have achieved competency, or that they can prove that they can now measure and compare a solid and liquid. For instance, let's say they use water, ice, and steam to show the competency that they can measure and compare solids and liquids. So that's just a little bit different of a model in the competency-based model than in a traditional classroom.
What initial apprehension or fears did you have about competency-based learning?
Some of my initial fears about competency-based learning centered around factors such as time, the amount of time it is going to take me to write my objectives. How am I going to come up with objectives that are measurable? Are they clear? Am I stating them in a way that's clear to the student and clear to an outside assessor or an accredited agency? How am I going to come up with my competencies? How am I going to create my assessments? Are my assessments going to be assessments that actually measure what I want them to measure? Are they valid? Are they reliable? Do I have a good, solid rubric? How am I going to map my curriculum so that it makes sense? How am I going to map it so that it makes sense for the overall school's goals? If I'm teaching fourth grade, is my curriculum consistent with the third grade teacher and the fifth grade teacher? Another concern I had was, how am I going to meet all of my students' needs, including those such as my ESOL students, my English speakers of other languages, or my ESE students, my exceptional student education learners? Because they have very different needs from the other students in my classroom, it worried me a bit to make sure that I was accommodating them in the proper way. Also, how am I going to get them to show me competency on the same objective, because that was one of my requirements. Another concern I had was the planning and structuring of my classroom activities, so that I allowed my students the proper time to learn a skill, practice it in an activity or a given setting, and then show me competency in some form of assessment at the end, whether that be formal, informal. And then probably my last concern was designing my assessments so that they accurately and fairly assessed my students' competency and mastery of the material. Again, I had to think about validity and reliability and making sure that I was on the proper level, making sure that I challenged my students but I wasn't too far over their heads, making sure that every single student in my classroom could show me competency of a given task that met my measurable, clear objective so that I could see that they had mastered the material.
What advice do you have for teachers transitioning to a competency-based model?
Some of the advice I would include would begin with just a few objectives in one discipline or even one unit. Don't try to plan a whole course, or don't try to plan a whole semester or a whole year. Start with something small. One way that I would begin would be to create a matrix for that unit or the course that you're going to teach. In your matrix, state the big idea or the main concept you want to cover. Then, come up with a few clear objectives stating how you expect your students to show competency of that concept. After you've done that, think about your assessment tool for how you're going to assess that student's competency on that particular objective. And then lastly, list how you're going to remediate students who don't achieve mastery. When you walk through all the sections of a matrix like that, it forces you to think and state clearly what it is you want your students to be able to do when they leave your class. So if you walk through a stated objective and it says the student will apply, or the student will create, the student will design something, and then you create your assessment based on that objective, if those two match well, you should have a very clear line for what you're going to teach and what you expect your student to be able to do. Then it's just a matter of creating your tools. I guess one of the most important things to remember is that the use of competencies in curriculum design provides direction for your course or direction for your subject area. It also provides direction for your entire school. It's going to help you produce competent students, which in the end is your goal, but it's going to take time, so you have to be patient with it.
Considering the insights provided by Professor Pullen, what are your initial thoughts on competency-based learning? How might a competency-based approach impact how students learn in your classroom? What fears or challenges do you anticipate with a competency-based model?